Absolutely. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Danielle and Rachel to this conversation. As I was saying, it's just 2 months in, and we're already on COZ 10, and we actually have COZs booked to COZ 26 at the end of December. So it seems to be a kind of thing that people enjoy, that to have a conversation, to greet and meet their friends and colleagues, and to give us such a wide variety of Jewish music. So Rachel has organized this with Danielle. Okay,
David Miller, if I can ask that you keep yourself muted.
Daniel Miller seems to be tuned in twice, so it could be that that's what's causing the problem. But anyway, keep yourself muted and that should be fine. Rachel has kindly organized this with Danielle, because Rachel spent some months in Cambridge. Probably that's where you got to know each other. Yes. Rachel's an ethnomusicologist based in New Haven, Connecticut. Her research focuses on contemporary Jewish liturgical music and ritual practice, like so many of us, or many of you, shall I say. Danielle's research explores the music-making activities of the Victorian Anglo-Jewish community. She's also a singer and directs the Kol Echad Hebrew choir in Cambridge, and I'm sure we'll hear a lot more about all these things. So over to you, Rachel and Danielle.
Hi, Danielle.
Hi.
It is wonderful to have you. So what Geraldine did not say, and which I feel like I should mention to everybody so that we can all embarrass Danielle, is that she just finished writing her dissertation and she will soon be Dr. Danielle. So Congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'll let you know after next Friday, all being well.
All right, well, we'll be pulling for you next Friday.
Thank you.
Why don't you tell them what it's about, Danielle? I know about this.
Well, Rachel's going to ask me about it.
Yes, because I've read it and I really liked it, but since I'm not on her committee, I don't have a say in this. So okay. What we decided to do is to sort of pick up the format that we had last week on this with Mimi and Ofra, which was we're going to interview each other. And I'm going to start by interviewing Danielle for a while. And
okay, can I just ask everybody else who's not Danielle or Rachel to mute themselves, please? Okay, good. I'll mute myself too.
So, and then about halfway through, the tables will magically flip and Danielle will start interviewing me. So, Danielle, ready for the hot seat?
Let's give it a go. It'll be good practice for next week, won't it?
Yes. So, just sort of as a basic background before we start getting into some of the details, much of your dissertation focuses on the famous Charles Garland Verinder. And since we're probably going to spend quite a bit of time in the next half hour or so talking about him, can you introduce him to us? He's not here.
No, he's not here. No, so Charles Garland Verinder came to my attention from singing in synagogue choirs in the UK since I was about 12 or 13. He's written one song which lots of people know, which is a tune to SI&I, Psalm 121. I introduced this to my choir in Cambridge, Kol Echad, and did a bit of digging about him. It was at that point that I realised that he was actually an Anglican musician, organist, trained under the royal organist at the time, Sir George Elvey. And so that got my brain going in all sorts of different directions about, why was he writing synagogue music, and, how involved was he in the synagogue music world? And initially I thought I was going to be writing a dissertation about interfaith music, Jewish-Christian relations through music, and I sort of am, but actually it opened up a whole series of questions about how Jewish musicians and Jewish music making was involved in just 19th century British music making in general. And he's such an interesting man because he got involved in so many different ways in promoting Jewish music and performing Jewish music, working with Jewish musicians, both in the synagogue but outside as well. He is wonderfully opinionated. If you read any of his letters, either in the West London Synagogue Archive, so that's where he worked as the organist for 45 years. If you read his letters there, or in the Jewish Chronicle, he wrote to them all the time. He's just got such a sort of earnest but very informed manner, and you can get so much you can get so much about the environment at the time just by reading his writings. He just completely fascinated me, and he's become a really good friend over the last 5 years. So yeah, I think he'll be a hard one to let go, and I don't think I will be letting him go. You know, he's so involved in the Jewish music world. You know, he just crops up everywhere. Yeah, he's great.
You never do let your dissertation subject go.
No.
So it was, I found it very interesting to read about how key a figure he was, particularly at the West London Synagogue, in sort of shaping what would become Anglo-Jewish music. And in fact, you start out by talking quite a bit about the concept of Anglo-Jewishness, about what it means to be British and Jewish, because this is an era in which nationalism, you know, the sort of ur form of nationalism is on everyone's mind, and people are starting to figure out what it means to be British. And then you get Jewish communities in England starting to figure out what it means to be British and Jewish. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the musical developments in West London Synagogue sort of, I guess, served as a staging ground for this kind of debate, what it means to be Anglo-Jewish.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's always really striking, so you don't get very much discussion about Anglo-Jewish music at all in Anglo-Jewish histories. So they'll talk a lot about Jewish reform and political emancipation for British Jews and sort of identity. You know, what does British Jewish mean, and you know, how can we represent that? In terms of what people tend to say about music, it's always everyone wanted a choir, and that seems to be the key thing that was the real kind of heart of the matter in terms of how they can present themselves musically as British Jews. And it was moving away from the chazan and the masharim and sort of bringing a bit more structure by having a choir. And this was very much mirroring what was going on in the church at the time as well. So this is sort of towards the end of the 1820s, 1830s, going into the 1840s was when you start properly seeing choirs regularly in synagogues. And at the same time, you've got what was called the Tractarian movement, sort of high Anglo-Catholic church movement, doing effectively the same thing. So they were sort of trying to bring a bit more structure to Anglican worship. And so there's this real parallel there of, right, okay, well, they've introduced choirs, choral singing, we should probably do the same. This is really important. You don't get much of a sense at this early stage of what they really want the choir to do other than to perform music. There's not a sense of it being something to help the congregation in terms of leading congregational song. The important thing just seems to be, we must have a choir. So I think it's almost a sort of professionalization of music as well. That's important. So that seems to be the main thing. I mean, the other thing that often gets talked about is just how involved certain communities of Jews, particularly in London, just engaged in social musical activities as well, sort of beyond the synagogue. So going to concerts, being part of recitals and choral societies and things like this. And this is something that I'm hopefully going to look at now I've finished the dissertation. But there's this real sense of, these are proper British activities. We are very much assimilated into this environment. This is what we do.
So that's sort of an association of choral singing with how we sound British.
Yeah.
And that to me is very interesting, particularly because Verinder introduces a mixed choir, the mixed voice choir. And
he does eventually, yeah.
Yeah. And so, you know, it is an amazing thing. He seems to have done it out of practicality more than anything else, because he preferred working with grown women over little boys, as I think most people would.
Yes.
But you've also written a little bit about a certain cultural ambivalence towards women singers, not just in the synagogue setting, but in this larger Victorian setting. And that's something that I'm very interested in, is how women singers sort of played into into the Victorianness of the West London synagogue.
Yeah, they were a real kind of, they were in very much a kind of halfway house, and I still need to do a bit more research into getting a much broader sweep of the different opinions, but certainly looking at the various opinions in things like the Jewish Chronicle, people were very much in two minds about whether women should participate in singing in synagogues at all. You know, I think some people were quite happy to, you know, let them stay in the ladies' gallery and sort of listen, but not really participate. There was a lovely letter that I found about, you know, there was a letter written by someone who said, you know, we're very old-fashioned, and we you know, we do think that synagogue music should be sung not too prominently by ladies, and that kind of sums up to me actually this attitude that actually a lot of people just sort of let women increasingly participate in synagogue worship without really making a stand about it from a religious perspective. The thing that's interesting from the sort of Victorian perspective is that there were real issues about Victorian female modesty. And so when you do get the mixed choir at the West London Synagogue, so that was in 1865, he finally managed to get this through after 3 years of asking. The women were quite keen to sing, but they didn't want to be seen. So they were sitting behind a screen and singing from there, so that they weren't seen by the male congregation. So yeah, I think there's a real kind of dichotomy, and of course there are issues for women themselves in terms of, yes, their modesty, whether they wanted to sing as part of a choir, whether they actually wanted to sing full stop, you know. So obviously you get lots of female soloists at this time, but obviously then one of the things that I want to look at is Jewish female soloists and their work outside of the synagogue, and where they performed and to whom, and that kind of thing. So yeah, it's sort of work in progress, this, but I think it's interesting that waves were starting to be made, but actually quite a lot of this happened quite naturally as well.
Yeah. A number of years ago, I was talking with Jackie Chernett, who is a cantor in London, and she was describing some of the background of these synagogue choirs, and described the choir of Hampstead Synagogue, which is Orthodox. Yeah. And that they apparently, she says they were the first to have a mixed choir, the first Orthodox synagogue in the UK to have a mixed choir. And then in 1986, they also became the last holdout after a series of chief rabbis discouraged Orthodox synagogues from having mixed choir. So I thought that was very interesting. And she also told me, with this somewhat amused chuckle in her voice, that they had been wondering what the chief rabbi would say about having a mixed choir, and then they decided it was easier to ask forgiveness than permission.
Well, I think when they first had the mixed choir, which was at the very end of the 19th century, they actively went against the recommendation of the chief rabbi.
Knowing that he wasn't going to tell them to disband in the end.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's the idea of Orthodox mixed choirs was something that was very new to me when I first started looking into this. So, and it's also very interesting considering how traditional the West London Synagogue was for much of that time. That there was not as much separating West London from other sort of officially Orthodox synagogues than one might expect.
Yeah, I think it's easy to say that. I think now, I think probably at the time, bearing in mind that, I mean, they didn't call themselves the Reformed Synagogue, but other people did. I think there probably was quite a lot of difference, and certainly the musical difference is commented upon a lot in the Jewish Chronicle. And it's sort of commented on in two different ways. There are some people who are very dismissive of it, saying actually this stops people being able to join in because you just end up with this silenced congregation because they're all just listening to the music. And there are other people who are very much in praise of this new high quality musical sound. And I think this is the thing that Verinder was very keen to achieve, and the reason that he wanted to have female voices rather than treble voices is he wanted this consistently high quality sound. I think he was slightly unimpressed with the behavior of some of his trebles, but I think also just continually having to retrain as their voices broke and then having to replace them with other singers, and so it made for quite a difficult rehearsal process.
Yeah.
The other thing that was quite interesting with the women in the choir is actually that they had female singers from, I think, the very earliest services, but only in sort of unofficial services, or rather not sort of High Holy Days and Shabbat, but they'd had them at the consecration of the synagogue, so the foundation ceremony. They had confirmations rather than bar and bat mitzvahs, so they had them on these days, which weren't then on sort of on Saturdays and Friday nights and things. So they had been incorporated, and actually I even saw something which said that they'd been involved around Yom Kippur before they got involved on regular Shabbat morning services. So there's a real kind of strange question of what was allowed and what wasn't, and what reason, because obviously from a religious point of view, if you're not allowing women to sing on Shabbat, then you probably think they'd be equally unallowed on Yom Kippur, even more so perhaps, I don't know. So there's an awful lot of questions that I haven't quite pieced together yet.
Yeah. I mean, I know that I have been at some synagogues that have used the High Holy Days as sort of a little moment of musical lawlessness and a time to introduce fancy bits that they wouldn't ordinarily use. But it is probably something you'd have to get down to the individual synagogue level to find out.
Yeah.
So just more on choirs in general, just because that's essentially how you and I met, was through the choir. What role did the choir play in worship? That is, you've talked about them silencing the congregation, which I think is certainly an effect that choirs can have, and whether it's intended or not, again, it gets down to the individual congregation. But the choir is something that isn't quite the congregation and isn't quite the chazan. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how, West London or any of the other synagogues that you've looked at, how they might have seen the role of the choir.
I think, again, it's excuse me, it's very varied. So certainly the West London Synagogue choir did seem to be very much a performance choir, but at regular intervals Verinder did try and introduce congregational singing classes so that people could actually join in with the singing in the services. And so there is this kind of mix of like I said at the beginning, not being really sure what the choir was meant to be. They just wanted a choir. And the congregational classes never really went down terribly well. So I don't know whether they were just poorly attended or there wasn't much interest. But certainly every 10 or 20 years, notes come up again in the West London Synagogue archives saying, I did try, but no one came, sort of thing.
Womp womp.
Yeah, so from the West London's perspective, they did seem to be very much there to perform. And while the music itself, if you look at the volumes that were published, aren't difficult, the music isn't difficult to sing, there are some moments where Verinder writes a little bit more to be a bit more elaborate, and he has some soloists come in and do bits and pieces. The melodies, thinking particularly of things like SI&I, are fairly straightforward, quite hymn-like, and I think that was the kind of thing that people did want, things that they could just sort of sing along to within an octave range, something that was comfortable for most voices. You do then get in other synagogues, so the sort of best evidence of things like that are some of the other publications that came out within the 19th century. So the most obvious one is the Blue Book, which is sort of internationally renowned, really. So that came out at the very end of the century. And it's very explicit that this was here for choirs, but also to aid home practice, so that the whole family could learn maybe just the melodies, not necessarily the harmonies that go with it, but you know, there was this sense that choral singing was there to aid congregational worship. You even get that with the Emmanuel Aguilar and David de Sola book, which was the first one really to come out in the 1850s. So that was the Spanish and Portuguese collection of ancient melodies. They were also harmonized. And again, Aguilar specifies this is also to help with home practice. So there was this sense that, yes, these would be performed in the synagogue, but also so that people could sort of come together and learn them to then join in with other, in the services.
Yeah, one of the more interesting features of the Blue Book is that the soprano and alto lines, the roles that are either sung by adult women or by small children, are written in tonic solfa notation as well as note heads, and that would seem to indicate that, you know, they really want the kids to learn to sing in harmony, because tonic solfa was used in schools. Children to sing in choirs. So I thought that was very interesting about the Blue Book. And I also love the flat out description that the Blue Book has in its introduction of what the ideal family ought to be. It's very aspirational, this very middle class family that, you know, that has a piano and that has somebody who knows how to play a piano, probably mama. And, you know, then the creators of the Blue Book are kind of imagining this wonderful evening of mama playing the piano and the family singing, standing around and singing. And that's very lovely. And then you talk about the West London Choir as, you know, a performance choir. So it seems like what you would mean by that would be choir stands in front of congregation, sings, congregation sits and smiles. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little more on what role they're performing. Are they performing the role of the congregation in place of the congregation, or are they performing the role of the chazan in leading prayer?
I think it's more like the latter, particularly if you look at, again, returning to the women's voices, if you're thinking about the choir as representing the congregation, obviously having women means that, you know, half of your congregation is now being represented. What you do find, though, is that a lot of women, as soon as they were getting married, then left the choir. So there was, again, this sort of issue of modesty and not wanting to participate in something once that they were married. And so actually, from that point of view, the sort of the married female congregation were no longer sort of represented anymore. There are quite a few comments as well about the singers that you had in Veranda's choir, and you saw me last week when we were chatting get very excited about one recent discovery that I made about who did sing in Veranda's choir. And you had some really important professional or soon to be professional singers, and so I think there was a sense that they were leading, they were putting, you know, they were being a professional, they were musically leading the congregation, and bearing in mind as well that the ministers did no chanting at all, or very, very little. I think there's a sense, looking at the volumes, that this started to come in a bit later, but David Wolfe Marks, the first minister, was adamant that, you know, everything would be spoken except for when the choir was singing. So yes, it's very much a kind of leading from the front sort of attitude, I think.
David Wolfe Marks sounds like he was a lot of fun at parties. Can you tell me a little bit more about some of the individual women singers that Verender fostered? Because that was wonderful to read, was sort of that he actively supported some of these soloists, and be excited about some of them for us, because they're wonderful.
I'm an avid, well, I say Gilbert and Sullivan fan. That's not quite right. I have participated in a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan productions, and so know quite a lot about Gilbert and Sullivan. And one of the things that I was so happy to see was I sort of put together various details of one particular singer in the choir who is generally listed as L. Abraham, who was a female singer who joined the choir in about 1869, 1870. Her father was the secretary of the synagogue, Philip Abraham, and he sort of pushed her into wanting to be in the choir, first as volunteer and then as a paid member of the choir. She then left in 1874 to pursue a professional career. I found another letter which gave her first name as Leonora, and I thought there is a very famous Gilbert and Sullivan soprano from the late 19th century called Leonora Braham, and this is Leonora Abraham. I'm wondering whether this is the same person. And just by using things like ancestry.co.uk to kind of place addresses and family trees and things, I've worked out that it is actually Leonora Braham before she became one of Gilbert and Sullivan's leading ladies at the Savoy Theatre. So she created the role of Yum Yum in The Mikado, I think Patience in Patience. And yes, and so for me this was fantastic because, you know, this was someone who I've known about for years and years and years, who, I don't know if anyone's seen the film Topsy Turvy, about the creating of the Mikado, but it's the character played by Shirley Henderson. So actually she is there on, well, not Leonora Braham, but someone is actually portraying her on film. And so, yeah, this was a really exciting bit of my research. I found it relatively late. And it was actually her that sort of opened up what I now want to do in terms of my postdoctoral work, which is actually looking at this in more detail of, you know, who are these people and what is their music making life outside of the synagogue as well as in the synagogue. Since submitting my thesis, I've actually found another singer whose name I'd come across several times in the West London archives, as a lady called Julia Ehrenberg, who I later discovered was also one of Gilbert and Sullivan's leading ladies as Julia Warwick. So Julia now spelt the Italian way rather than sort of the English anglicised way. And so here you've got two fairly substantial professional soprano figures starting their singing careers off in Verinder's West London Synagogue Choir in the 1870s. And I'm sure there are more. There's a woman called Louisa Van Norden who came from a pretty well-known musical Jewish family, who then became Louisa Duca, who and then was through her marriage became the aunt of Paul Duca, who's the famous composer who wrote The Sorcerer's Apprentice. You know, so there's sort of all these interesting connections. So I'm interested to find out more. I think the best way that I found of just sort of associating or seeing who is associating with whom is going through to sorry if that's my child screaming downstairs, through the Jewish Chronicle, just to see, you know, so this is the name of a soloist that sang one of Verinder's compositions on this occasion at the West London Synagogue. Here she is giving a recital with all these other Jewish musicians, you know, 5 years later. And so a lot of them, I think, were more kind of small-scale recitalists, occasionally did big concerts when a whole lot of them got together, and they performed at some pretty big venues. So the Royal Albert Hall was used quite a lot. Also the Victoria Hall, which we now know as the Old Vic, you know, so that the sort of their musical activity was pretty diverse.
Right. Yeah.
So yes, I do get very excited about this, but I still need to do a bit more work on it.
Well, you know, women singers, particularly because they change their names so much, and you know, they sometimes have to essentially put up a false character. It's sometimes very difficult to research women singers. So I'm very glad that more of women's activity is coming into public notice. And
I mean, certainly from that point of view, actually, just using things so sort of fairly, sort of, well, not unconventional research sort of methods, but you know, things like genealogy websites, just those kinds of things have really opened up a whole load of this for me recently.
You know what? Thank God for the Mormons. They put up a lot of genealogy websites. So one more thing that I want to ask you a little bit about, and then maybe, particularly given Shrieky small childness, it may be time to switch. We've been sort of talking about extending Jewish musical life beyond the synagogue, and you had also written something a little bit about secular Hebrew choral societies, which, as you and I both know, still exist in the UK today in various iterations and forms. And I think it might be an interesting segue to talk about the role that they played in the Victorian era, these sort of Jewish performance choirs that existed at the same time as non-Jewish performance choirs, with the role that they played in society and interacting with each other.
Yeah, so this is an area I still need to do some more research, because again, it's something that I looked up relatively late. My first knowledge of it came from notices of the Hebrew Choral Association, which appeared in the 1880s and 90s in the Jewish Chronicle, and principally through their performance of Verender's cantata, which is called Israel in Diversity and in Deliverance, Israel in Adversity and in Deliverance, which he wrote for his undergraduate music degree when he was submitting this at Oxford. It was then published in the 1870s, and then it seems that its sort of first known performance was not until the 1890s by this Hebrew Choral Association. There's also a biography of Verender in the Salisbury Cathedral records, because he was a chorister at Salisbury. So again, in the 1890s, they put together this record of all ex-choristers, and his little biography says, musical director of the Hebrew Choral Association. So he was only the musical director of the Hebrew Choral Association for about a year. And I think that was while they were rehearsing his piece. So it sounds like they had people come in and do bits and pieces. So they seem, from what I can gather, to do pieces of music which are not necessarily Jewish or Hebrew liturgy, but are based on Old Testament texts. So works that were comfortably performable by Jewish performers. There are a couple of others that I've been made aware of. So there was the choir of the Jewish Working Men's Club, which surprised me slightly, but they seem to be pretty active. The other one was in Liverpool, the Liverpool Choral Association, which I recently discovered was linked to the Shul in Liverpool, but also seemed to do concerts and sort of fundraisers and things like that as well. So yes, again, I'm sort of still researching exactly what repertoire they performed. There are interesting things as well, like discovering that there was a Bayswater Choral Society, which was directed by Arthur Friedlander, who worked for a few different of the Orthodox synagogues in London at sort of around the 1880s, 1890s. And so I don't know whether that was a specifically Jewish choral society or whether he happened to be leading a sort of broader choral society. But that's also quite interesting in terms of, what music did he give to perform, for the choir to perform? Were the choir particularly welcoming to Jewish choristers? Were other non-Jewish choral societies perhaps less welcoming? There's a quite interesting kind of I think what this has done for my research is actually say, okay, well, why are they specifically Jewish choral societies, particularly if, unlike things like Kol Echad, where we met, we sing Jewish and Hebrew repertoire, they don't seem to be. So is this their outlet for singing because they're not welcome in other places? And so this sort of opens up a lot of interesting questions, I think.
It is very interesting, because when you have sort of a multi-word descriptor like Jewish choral society, it's always a question, what is the Jewish modifying? Is it modifying the music, which is the way that Kol Echad functions? Kol Echad sings Jewish music, however the choir chooses to define that. Or is it the Jewish choir in that it's the choir of Jewish singers who are singing anybody's music? That I think is an interesting distinction that really depends not so much on the choir, but certainly on the era, I think. And you can tell a lot about how welcoming a place is to Jews by what the Jewish in Jewish choir is modifying.
I mean, it's interesting looking at some of the concert notices in the Jewish Chronicle as well, where there is a recital being performed evidently by a lot of Jewish performers, and the repertoire I mean, it includes a lot of the classics, but there are some sort of noticeable things like repertoire by sort of contemporary Jewish composers. There's very much this sense that we are supporting our community.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I don't know if it's because other people aren't necessarily, or whether it's because they're sort of trying to make the point, particularly that actually Jewish composers or British Jewish composers exist, and here they are in the public forum, and
Yep.
There's lots of really intricate sort of ins and outs about it. But yeah, this is my postdoctoral work.
Fabulous. Well, I wish you good luck on that. And I think as we switch, because Laurie showed me how to do this, it may be time for a musical interlude.
Excellent.
The first piece that you mentioned when we started this conversation was Verander's Esa Enai. And I think, since that's the piece of Verander's that really has been absorbed into the contemporary British, at least Reform and Masorti and Liberal scene, I figured we might listen to at least a little bit of it as sung by Kol Echad.
Excellent.
So we're going to go on the exciting technical adventure of figuring out how to do this. So music, share. It's in here somewhere.
Danielle, I'm going to go ahead and mute you while she plays the clip, just because we are getting some background noise on your side.
Sorry. Yeah.
Okay. I'm actually just having a little trouble finding it here. Tzadik Hatmar, Baruch Hu, and Kelohino. All right, I know that there's a recording somewhere, but it's because I don't want to spend all my time looking for this. We'll play something a little bit more characteristic, I think, of certainly the current scene. Again, this is the Kol Echad recording of Louis Lewandowski's Tzadik Katamar. This is another choral piece that has really been absorbed into being a congregational melody, or even a little bit of congregational harmony. So as a little bit of a palate cleanser, I thought we might like this. Tzadik Katamar. So I'm now open for your questions. Hit me with all you got.
Right. Well, I struggled to find questions for you that I then wouldn't want to just sort of chat to you about. So I've sort of written a few things down that I thought, well, I'll ask you, and then hopefully we can open up some conversation afterwards. And I thought, obviously, I've been talking mostly about sort of the 19th century, mid to late 19th century. And your work sort of then continues that going into the 20th and 21st century. And so there's this real sense of things developing and changing, and some of it's quite natural, and some of it's sort of very much designed. And one of the things that I really love about some of the recent work that you've done is what you've termed the song that goes like this, which is this idea of a song that everybody knows, but no one really knows where it comes from or how old it is, and actually thinking about things like Tzadik Hatama or SINI. You know, lots and lots of people know this, but don't necessarily know where it comes from. And I just wanted to ask you a little bit, just to kind of talk about your research on the song that goes like this, and sort of, what different types of songs that go like this are there, and what have you discovered from your research?
Well, thank you. So when I coined the term, the song that goes like this, I have to confess that, first of all, it came from more than one interview that I've done with people. When I sit down with people to do interviews, one of the questions that I often ask them is, what is your favorite piece of synagogue music, or what really speaks to you? And a number of times, this has happened both in the United States and the UK, I'll be sitting down with somebody and they'll say, my favorite piece of synagogue music, the one that really is closest to my heart, is that piece. You know, that piece, the one that goes like this, and they'll sing it. And I have found that that is tremendously interesting to me, because some people can remember learning the piece, and it's usually taught to them by, you know, a rabbi or a teacher in a shul classroom when they were little, or they moved to a new town and moved to a new shul, and this was something that their new shul sang, so they sort of picked it up that way. And it's not attributed. It's not that no one knows where these songs come from. The bulk of them are probably no more than about 150 years old at the outside. And a lot of the songs that go like this, we know who composed the songs that go like this. But when I say we know, what I mean is that people who study and pay attention to synagogue music know where the songs come from. And people who are not synagogue music professionals in some way are never told, and it's largely because there's no real room in the service. Nobody says, and now please open up your hymnal to page 268, where we're going to sing the anthem David's Lamentation by William Billings. I'm also a shape note singer. Page 268 in the Sacred Harp is, in fact, David's Lamentation by William Billings. And nobody says that in a synagogue because, you know, the bottom dropped out of the synagogue hymnal market in about 1970. And it's awkward to say, and now we're going to sing this prayer to this tune. And very few people do that. So you pick up these melodies and they just sort of become associated with people. They become the song that goes like this. And I swore when I was 20 that I would never use any term that came from semiotics ever, but life has changed and I now use semiotic terms. What's very interesting to me is the Peircean term an index. That is, it's a sign that points to the object that it's describing. So it's sort of, you know, kind of a marker and, you know, something, a stand-in. And one thing that I found very interesting is the way that certain tunes get associated with certain people in synagogues to the point where they become indexes or indices, I think is the correct plural, of those people. So that in my current shul in New Haven, Mayor Finkelstein's Ledor Vador, Ledor Vador, Ledor Vador, Ledor Vador, Nagid God Lachan. We all know this tune. It's become pretty common. That's become indexed in my current shul to a particular congregant. We're a lay-led service, and so congregants take it in turns to lead service. And that tune has become indexed to this congregant. In much the same way that De Sola's Adon Olam, Adon Olam, Asher Malach, B'terem Kol Yetzir Niva, Liet Nasa, Echepto Kol, Azoi Melech Shemo Nikra. In that melody, again, which a lot of people in England, you go and they can sing it. In that Shalom in Cambridge, that's, oh good, we can talk. Oh damn, we now can't talk about people. But that piece has become indexed to a specific congregant. And that, to me, represents sort of the best and the worst of the songs that go like this, is that people don't remember who actually wrote the tune, but they become so much a part of a congregation's life, that it's Jonathan's Lador Vador or Sheila's Adon Olam.
And do you
I
think,
don't know if there's anything more specific you wanted me to discuss?
Well, I thought there's something really interesting there about people who write these melodies, particularly now, and it's something that is, like you say, we know that this is Lewandowski or this is Verinder or whatever. Thinking about the church tradition, where you do have sometimes, and now the choir will perform Bruckner's Locus Iste, but then you also have Let Us All Turn to page 232 in the hymn book to sing All Things Bright and Beautiful. And, and so there's this dichotomy there of, people who, people wrote both, but you've got the big pieces of music that, still retain ownership. And then the hymns where actually very few people will know who has written them. It's usually written in the hymn book who compose particular tunes and things. Do you think people who have written music for the synagogue, say in sort of the last 50 to 100 years, kind of expect that to happen to their music when they're composing it? Do they want their name almost to be anonymized because it is just a song that goes like this, or would they rather retain some of that ownership?
That is a really interesting question, because when you say expect, there's so many different ways that you can take that term. So if you understand expect to be anticipate that something will happen, I think that some of them did. Some of them just sort of expected this is, if this piece becomes a hit, this is going to happen to it. Now, whether they liked the idea or not is a completely separate question. And we know for a fact that several of them really, really didn't like it. I'm blanking on the guy's name, and I'm going to remember it at the least possible opportune moment. Israel Goldfarb, yes, Israel Goldfarb, who was a rabbi in Chazan and all-around music guy at Brooklyn's Kane Street Synagogue in the early 20th century. He's the one who wrote, why do I always blank on this? That Sabbath song. Somebody in the chat will remind me of this, because my name.
Shalom Aleichem.
Excuse me?
Shalom Aleichem.
Yes, Shalom Aleichem. Thank you. Shalom Aleichem, Malachei. That one that everybody knows. He wrote that piece, and he actually did live long enough to see this become anonymized and to see people singing it as though it were a folk song. And this is something that Barbara Bortz has pointed out in her recent article in the Journal of Synagogue Music, which you should all read. Most people sang it wrong. He wrote it with an ABBA structure, but people sing it ABAB. And we do have some record of him. I think he was at a Cantor's Assembly meeting, and he was pissed off that people were singing this melody that he'd written and calling it old and traditional, because he knew that he'd written it and he'd spent the work to write it. And I know that the Women Cantors Network, mostly based in the United States, is working very actively against anonymization, because they point out quite correctly that attribution is a Jewish value, and that it also anonymization, I think, tends to affect women quite a bit. There's been a phenomenon recently, and by recently, I think I mean sort of since the 90s, to talk about Debbie Friedman music, which is a term that encompasses Debbie Friedman's oeuvre, but also encompasses a lot of other music that she didn't write, but that is written in the same style. And a lot of it is written by women. And if, you know, if all these women composers are just called Debbie Friedman, then that sort of gives the impression that A, that nobody's really writing synagogue music, that it's just sort of happening, and B, that the only woman who really wrote synagogue music that was worth singing was Debbie Friedman, which erases a whole lot of the women who are actively writing really amazing music.
Do you find...
Well, one more thing though, on the other hand, you know, so I think a lot, to answer your question, a lot of people expect their music to be anonymized. A lot of people are not happy about it, but there is a school of thought that was expressed to me by a cousin I met once, who attributed it to Joanna Spector, that it ought to be considered the highest form of praise when your name gets erased from your music. You know, that it's become so beloved that nobody knows who you are anymore. And I think that's certainly a way of looking at it. I suspect on balance, a lot of composers may not take that view.
I think, I mean, what you were saying about the changing the melodic structure is really interesting. If you think about Verinder's SI&I, a lot of congregations, when they sing the melody, will add in a bit of the alto version. So if you look at the Blue Book version, there's the May I in your voice. So that's taking over a bit of the alto bit, which Verinder never wrote. So he sort of wrote sort of the harmonies which kind of crossed from the altos down into the tenors, and so you never had this kind of rocking motion. And I think it's really interesting that now when people sing it sort of in unison, you've ended up with this little motion that actually wasn't ever in the original. But
that is the folk process at work.
Yeah, and actually it's become a real part of the identity of that piece of music. And I wondered if you could say something a little bit about, yes, how this anonymization and, you know, even just having one person sing a melody compared to another person, how that changes the identity of this, yes, a piece of music that's become very common to communities. You know, does it affect you so based on your research and speaking to people, does it affect them if they go to shul and they hear a familiar melody but it's sung wrong, I suppose? I think people who are highly musically literate really don't like this. Debbie Friedman, I used to go visiting shuls, and she would hear people, you know, singing her music a little bit wrong, and she'd correct them. Sometimes she'd do it at her concerts. You know, she had this wonderful personality and loved to invite people to sing along at her concerts. And every now and then people would sing along, and they'd sing the version that they'd learned in their shul. Okay, I'm back again. Yeah. And she would occasionally have to stop the concert and say, no, that's not quite how I wrote it. It goes like this. I mean, it is completely obvious why composers don't like that, because they put a lot of effort into writing music and they want the music to sound the way they want it to sound. But it is also like the game that, at least when I was little, we called telephone, where kids are sitting in a circle and somebody says a sentence, whispers a sentence in the ear of the person next to them, and it goes around the circle, and what comes out at the end is often a little bit garbled. And, you know, that's sort of the way, what happens when people, you know, maybe miss-sing a note, or are singing it to somebody over the phone, or are, you know, making up other words just because they feel like it. And it's that, I think, is sort of an almost unavoidable byproduct of a community adopting a song, is that you're never going to adopt it exactly. It's one of the reasons that we have sheet music, is because nobody can ever really remember exactly what a piece of music sounds like. And as we have become much more used to having sheet music, you know, for years and years and years, the way that people learned music was orally, and we would change. That's why we have song families. And we've become very used to having sheet music, and we've become very used to the idea of crediting composers. And we've kind of forgotten that this is what happens with the folk process. So
in some, and that's why I'm not completely discounting this idea that it's a badge of honor to have your song anonymized. There's a good reason for people to say that. It is, I'm not sure that I personally believe that it's necessarily the great thing to have it anonymized, but I think if your song is going to become a popular hit, you're going, and people are just going to sing it, you're just going to expect that people are going to alter it, and it's going to be massaged to fit people's voices, and it's going to become a little fuzzy at the edges. And I think that that's sort of a thing that people do. And I kind of like that sort of, this is how people sort of alter songs to fit themselves. It's a relationship.
I mean, there's almost a sense there that we've come full circle from where my research has started, of congregations singing melodies that were familiar to a lot of them, but actually they all kind of sang them slightly differently because they all came from different places and inherited it slightly differently. And so actually choirs were introduced to try and bring a bit more structure to now actually having a similar thing developing now, where you have a huge sort of collection of tunes that lots of people know in slightly different versions and at slightly different speeds, and some people can sing them higher than others and some people can sing them lower, and I suppose it's this sense of, is this what Jewish music actually should be and always should have been? And the development that we've seen over the last 200 years has sort of changed the scope of things, but actually the core of synagogue worship has always been the same.
Well, I think once you start getting into this is what Jewish music should be, you're getting very prescriptivist. And I certainly do think that a lot of the 20th century was the era of prescriptivism in Jewish music. There was a lot of people, both ethnomusicologists and musicologists and synagogue music professionals and rabbis and generally opinionated people, who wrote a lot about what synagogue music ought to sound like. And to a certain extent, this is still an evergreen topic. What ought synagogue music to sound like? And and that it's a prescriptivist approach to synagogue music, and it's certainly it has certainly helped keep interest in synagogue music alive, and it's caused a lot of people really to think very actively about what they're doing when they're programming a service or when they're introducing a new piece to a congregation. And in that sense, there's a lot of value in this prescriptivist idea of Jewish music. Prescriptivism has essentially helped create a lot of the hymnals. It helped create the Union hymnal. It helped create the Blue Book. It helped create the new Reform songbook in the UK. It's helped create Shirenu in the United States. So a lot of the written collections that we have, even back to Sulzer and Lewandowski, who composed music because they wanted to improve the service for their understanding of improvement. I mean, certainly that's led to and inspired the creation of a whole lot of music. It's made people think about music very seriously. But there is a limit to how far prescriptivism can go in a community setting. And that's the thing that I think is really lovely about congregations, about congregational singing versus choral singing. When Kol Echad sings Esai and I, we all sing the same version, and we all sing it together. And we're singing a version that is at least fairly close to, the harmonized version as it appears in the Blue Book. I don't know, when you retyped it, I don't know if you made any changes or not.
Nope.
Okay, so it's, close to the harmony that was printed in the Blue Book, which was presumably with Verender's approval of this harmony. And that's great, and it's wonderful, and it's beautiful, and I think I might have found it, so we might be able to listen to it in a bit. But what's also interesting is that it's a choral piece, but it's also a congregational piece. And when a congregation gets hold of it, you realize that aside from being this beautiful 19th century Victorian hymn melody, it's a 19th century Victorian hymn melody that doesn't quite understand that the text does not follow a regular meter, or at least the regular meter that Verender wants it to follow. And you have to massage the text to fit it into the tune. And, the text is forgiving. A lot of Hebrew texts are forgiving, and you can massage them to the tune. But one thing that I loved seeing traveling around the UK and going to various services at various shuls in London and outside of London, is this is a tremendously popular tune, and it's up to every congregation to decide how they're going to massage the text into the melody. So you get all these little variations. You know, this congregation will massage it this way, and this congregation does it this way. A lot of them will do that little rocking motion. I think in some of the later verses, it kind of helps with the text massaging. And then what's even more fun is when something like Shirei Chagiga, the Reform Jewish Music Festival, comes around, and everybody from all over the country gets into the same room and tries to sing Esai and I. And they all realize they're all massaging the text slightly differently, and then they all look at each other like this. And again, that's one of these wonderful, very human moments where you realize that prescriptivism is wonderful, but it can only go so far. And at some point you say, this is how it's sung, and the mistake is part of our tradition. It's like that old joke about the guy whose wife cut off the ends of the brisket.
I think, I mean, in terms of Kol Echad rehearsing it, I remember a fair chunk of one rehearsal being spent looking at verses, I think 3 and 4, and going da 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 da. And just
I think I remember that rehearsal.
Yeah, probably. But yeah, no, yes, it's interesting, and sort of you mentioned your work going around British synagogues and sort of, I'm aware that this is a conversation about Anglo-Jewish music, and so sort of returning to that a little bit. I wondered what struck you about British synagogue repertoire, because I mean, again, we had a conversation recently where we were talking about what does it mean to be a British Jew, and I was sort of saying that actually for me, having grown up singing in Edra Reform, now Edra and Hendon, I feel very much like a British Jew, but our British Jewish repertoire isn't just made up of music by British Jewish composers. You know, we've got Lewandowski and Salzer, we've got Naumburg, we've got, you know, various composers from various time periods and geographical places. And yet to me that still feels like Anglo-Jewish choral repertoire, because that's how I've been brought up with it. As someone coming into this and researching this, how did that feel to you, and what did people say anything about it when you were doing your research?
It was very interesting to me. The two things that I found were very interesting. One was the sense of layers that I have described the Anglo-Jewish repertoire, and in concentrating very much on the repertoire of the non-Orthodox synagogues, just because those were the synagogues that I focused on the most. What it seemed to me to be was an anthology, that it was very clear that while some music had been written by people who had been born in England and who would live their entire lives in England and die in England, so much more of it had been written, as you said, by Germans, by Austrians, by French people, and then also by immigrants. You know, De Sola was an immigrant, and Mombach was an immigrant, and also the way that music traveled. You know, that I was in Watlington at one point. I was at the West Norfolk group, and somebody was describing to me how the music at Bet Shalom in Cambridge, a lot of it had come from Manchester when people from Manchester came, and that people from Bet Shalom had then moved to Cornwall and brought some of Bet Shalom's music to Cornwall, so that you could see British Anglo-Jewish synagogue music is very interesting because it sounds like music that's been there forever and that is sort of very Victorian and very staid and very, you know, sit at home in the parlor with your hoop skirt spelling out around you. And in fact, it's very mobile music. It's music that has migration. It's music that is part of a conversation. It's music that is, you know, that essentially describes what it's like to be Anglo-Jewish. The thing that's really wonderful about the West London Synagogue in particular was the way that it conceived of the identity of British Judaism and later British Reform Judaism, really the concept of British Judaism as being a merging of two ethnicities, of taking elements from Ashkenazi Jewishness and elements of Sephardic Jewishness and melding them together and to form something that was sort of hybrid from the very start, but that then grew and became this layered anthology of an identity. And it is very hard to define because it is this mobile, this migratory, this wonderful mishmash of all different kinds of music, and people make it work. And people have been making it work for so long that they've kind of forgotten that that's what they're doing, which I thought was wonderful. And right now, it's sort of in the current decade, a lot of the new music that is coming into the country is coming in from either the United States or from Israel, which again, I don't see anybody fainting with surprise to hear this. The U.S. is it's another Anglophone country. It's the biggest Reform congregation, biggest Reform community in the world. Of course, it's going to have an influence. This was something that David Hoffman pointed out to me, that American Reform music doesn't always fit the way that a British Reform congregation wants to sing. So American Reform music tends to focus on, one or two lines of a prayer and sort of repeat them and explore them and get every last bit of musical juice out of them. And an American Reform congregation will sort of essentially top and tail the prayer and move on. And a British Reform congregation, they want to sing the whole thing. So that was interesting when I first arrived in England. Like, oh, okay, we're doing the whole thing then. We're staying on this one till the very end. And so this is wonderful, but it often means that you can't quite often use American music for British prayer. And that little bit of friction there has led to, it was one of the things that inspired this creation of this very loose group of composers called Shira Britannia, who said, I was talking to Judith Silver, who said that this was something that she and David Hoffman and a couple of other people cooked up, that they were inspired by all this music coming in from the United States and said, well, we've got talent too. And there's some really amazing synagogue music being written today in the UK that has this sort of very modern feel to it, but is also clearly appropriate for British synagogues. As if Debbie Friedman had, actually composed an entire prayer, or Craig Taubman had really through composed Hashkivenu. And there's some really wonderful music, both choral and solo, coming out of it. And I think, would you mind if I played some of it?
Sure.
Because I think let's see, this is going to be on the Corpus playlist. And yes, so this is Joseph Finley's Enkelohenu, which is a wonderful piece of music by any stretch of the imagination, that is very well suited, I think, to British Reform. And if I'm not mistaken, there's at least one congregation in England that is actively working on turning this into a congregational melody, which I love. So I believe that I'm sharing computer sound.
Me
Kol Echad once again. That is such a wonderful piece of music, you know, and it's something certainly that an American Reform congregation could adapt. An American Conservative congregation, not so much, although I think that Joseph does have a version for the conservative rendition of Ein Keloheni. But I think it's wonderful that this new layer is being added on top.
And there's an interesting thing. Oh, sorry, Rachel.
Well, I was just going to say, it's a wonderful thing to be able to see all of the different layers that make up British synagogue music.
I found myself wincing at the key change, thinking, "Did we do it? We did it. Yes, we got away with it."
We totally did. We totally did.
I mean, thinking about that piece in particular, you know, so there is the option to do that with piano accompaniment as well, which would be relatively uncommon in British synagogues. Is that something that, thinking about sort of US synagogues, is that something that would be more likely to be involved? Or, I mean, even in sort of more liberal British synagogues, I suppose that's something that could be incorporated.
The instrument that's most likely to be used is a guitar. Their American synagogues did go through the organ phase, and most synagogues don't have organs anymore. Cami in Chicago has a wonderful organ that they at least haul out for the High Holy Days. My current synagogue used to have an organ, and it's in the storeroom now, and they don't use it anymore. The instrument most likely is a guitar, and that's the instrument that everybody at the cantorial school, the Debbie Friedman School of Sacred Music, which is the Reform Movement's cantorial school in New York, guitar is a required course, not piano. I have seen the occasional American synagogue that has a piano or a keyboard of some sort, but it's not terribly common.
I mean, it's interesting, isn't it, that going into your topic in particular, there's almost a sense that we should have called this kind of Anglophone singing communities rather than English singing communities, because there's quite a lot of crossover, like you said, between the US and the UK. And I think one of the things that struck me a lot about what you were writing about female cantors, particularly in the UK, is the dependence on the US for training, or sort of for cantors generally for training. Yeah, I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about the history of the female cantor in the UK and sort of this crossover, because I find it fascinating.
Yes, so it is very interesting, because there is, if you want formal training, as in go to school for this, if you want formal training to be a cantor in the UK, it is very hard to do, just at, you know, whatever movement you're part of. My understanding is, and I'm sure that Alex Klein will have something to say about that, is that a lot of Orthodox Chazanim essentially learn by apprenticeship or they study overseas. And that the Reform movement in Britain sort of kept the idea of a Chazan at a distance, that there were some shuls, I think, you know, mostly outside of London, decided that there was somebody in the congregation who was a good singer and could really lead people, and would call this person the Chazan. And for much of history, that's sort of how you got to be a Chazan anyway, was you apprenticed or you were appointed because you had a good voice and you knew what you were doing. And that this was, for a large proportion of Jewish history, just not really available to women. And it started becoming more available to American women in the 20th century. And it was really in the 21st century that this started to become a thing for British women. And in fact, it was talking to the first two British women cantors who were trained, you know, at schools to become cantors. This is what really sparked my interest in British synagogue music to begin with. Jackie Chernett, who is a Chazan through the Masorti movement, she told me this very long story about how she had, as many people had done, I think, in the 20th century, gradually moved away from Orthodoxy. She tried the Reform movement. It didn't speak to her really very much. And she not only became a Chazan, she thought for a while she wanted to be a Reform rabbi, but then realized she was actually more interested in being a conservative cantor. Problem was that neither the conservative movement nor conservative cantors existed in the UK. And Jackie Chernett is one of those people where if you want something done right, you have to do it yourself. And so she helped to import the conservative movement into the UK, where it took root and sort of grew and adapted itself and really became the Masorti movement. Mm-hmm. And she then commuted, believe it or not, between London and New York to study at, I believe it was AJR, the Academy for Jewish Religion, and was given smicha as a chazan. And, she was past retirement age when she was commuting between London and New York, and that's sort of, that's a schlep, as they say. And so she has developed this online training academy called the European Academy for Jewish Liturgy. It's called EJL. And EJL was doing Skype lessons before the pandemic, so they're legit. And what they'll do is, if you want to learn how to lead a service, EJL will hook you up with a teacher. And they've got teachers all over the world. They've got teachers who speak all these different languages. And they will hook you up with a tutor, and you'll have lessons over Skype, which is a wonderful thing to do. And that's great, but all that you'll get from that is what your teacher can teach you, and you will get the knowledge, but you won't get any kind of official certification out of it. And what Zoe Jacobs has done for the Reform movement is very different. Her parents sent her to a Jewish summer camp in New York State as a child, because some people just go the extra mile or the extra kilometer. And that was where she met Ellen Dreskin and realized, A, that there was such a thing as a cantor, and B, that women could do this job. And she was, fresh out of undergraduate, decided to do the full Debbie Friedman's, I don't think it was the Debbie Friedman School, but decided to do the whole HUC cantorial school thing. And it was a little bit on spec for her, because she didn't know if there would be a job for her when she got back to the UK. There was certainly a job for her, in the United States, but she'd have to move. And I think she did her internship at West London, and then was very lucky, because about the time that her internship was ending, her childhood synagogue, Finchley Reform Synagogue, was looking for a second rabbi. And so she said to them, "You've known me all my life. How would you feel about a cantor instead of a second rabbi?" So, and that was great. And they hired her, and that's been wonderful. And one or two other women have gone to the United States to train. And what's really fascinated me is that it has been women, that the Reform movement in Britain has hired women as cantors. If they're hiring a trained cantor, it's going to be Zoe Jacobs, it's going to be Cheryl Wunsch, it's going to be Sarah Grabiner. It's going to be women who, people who come from cantorial schools with the training, it's going to be women. And that's fascinating to me, that there are men who are still doing the old-fashioned, I learned by apprenticeship, or I have a good voice and I'm, stood up in front of the congregation to sing. And they have not so much gone the training route, but it's interesting that of the people who do go the training route, that it's women. And I'm wondering if it's because the first people to do that in the non-Orthodox world were women.
I mean, there's the interesting thing as well, that you said that before you did have women taking on the role of cantor, there was this, again, striking difference between women's and men's leadership roles in terms of music in the synagogue, that obviously you had the men taking on the role of the chazan, but you actually got a lot of women musical directors, which again I just find interesting as a female musical director who has trained under a female musical director. It feels pretty natural to me that this has happened, but I just find that really striking.
I mean, one of the things that I sometimes wonder about is whether the idea of leading large groups of people in singing might have become a pink-collar job at some point. That this was sort of, in the same way that women do a lot of home cooking, but men are chefs, or or men are university professors and women are kindergarten teachers. That this is just the idea of being the choir director, of being the person who carries out the rabbi's plans for the service and who sort of executes the musical directive, that person is essentially a musical secretary, might be a woman. I also wonder if it might be part of a larger cultural tendency to feminize music, to see an interest in music as being, gendered female. I mean, the world is gendering rapidly. There are things that are gendered today that were not gendered when I was a kid, for instance. And I'm wondering if music might have been one of the things sort of in the early 20th century that might have started to gender female. Or another possible explanation for this is that it's sometimes easier for a congregation to accept something experimental and to accept, we're going to try a choir, we're going to try this piece, we're going to try the High Holy Days choir, we're going to try a quartet, if it's a woman doing the experimentation rather than a man. Men have for a long time had very defined roles in the synagogue, and some people I think feel uncomfortable if a man steps beyond his defined role, but because roles for women are much newer and not the boundary lines aren't as sharp, sometimes I think that women have more room to play around and to experiment. So I think it may be a combination of all of those.
Interesting. I'm aware that we're sort of coming to the end of reasonable time to chat, but yeah, thank you very much.
Shall we finish off with Esa and I, which I have now actually found?
Excellent. Yes.
We'll return to where we began.
I will mute myself again.
Singing along, that's great. Well,
thank you.
Yeah, this was wonderful.
Thank you to Rachel and Danielle for such a wonderful, informative presentation. There's been a lot of nice discussion in the chat, and I think it would be good for us to transition to some comments, and I think people can either, as they say, raise their hand in the virtual sense in Zoom, or since I can't see everybody, I will do my best to call. Charles, do you want to start us off? And then we'll move to Alex. So you'll need to unmute yourself and then...
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Well, ladies, it was terrific. Since it took an hour for somebody to figure out that they'd never heard of the Blue Book, I will do this very quickly. The original Blue Book was originally published as a small handbook, which looks like this, dedicated to the right business system, whatever. And then it grew into this. And that's why it's called the Blue Book. But the trouble is, when it was reissued in the 70s, just reprinted, it has a black cover, and I have no idea why. I think it's a Chilul Hashem. What we didn't mention is that in 1936, Alman added a few pieces, and Alman, actually, that Verinder that we just heard so beautiful, in the Blue Book, it says arranged Alman. Alman tried to do Milel Milra, he tried to tinker, and I have to tell you the most famous example, Lewandowski's Matovu, which everybody knows. Matovu, who doesn't know it? Except it's in the Blue Book, except it's in Alman's version, and he tried to improve the Hebrew, and what's actually written is Matovu, and I've never ever heard anybody sing it the way it's printed. So there's a PhD for someone. Why is printed music that's been 100 years printed and no one sings it the way it's printed? Either because no one can really, the truth is no one can read music, or everybody knows it sounds terrible. And I have one more thing. I was just going through my shelf and I found, I don't know how it got on my shelf. If anybody can tell me, here's something for another PhD. This is Coronation Anthem, The King Shall Rejoice, composed by, not by Handel, but composed by DMD, who was the choir director at Bayswater Shul. And this is his signed copy. It was dated 1911. I guess there was I can't read it because it's not clear. Maybe 19, I guess there was a coronation. So there's a PhD for someone, or even there's a challenge. Someone record DMD's version of The King Shall Rejoice for the next Please God coronation. Bis 120, when the next coronation comes, we will sing DMD's The King Shall Rejoice instead of Handel. And so good luck with that. Oh, by the way, this is an important, I'm nearly finished. This was printed at threepence, that's a penny and a 1.5 UP. But the tonic solfa version is only a penny halfpenny. Now, that tells you what we were talking about before, how universal it was for children who learned tonic solfa in school because a child only had a penny halfpenny, so he would buy the tonic solfa version. All right, I'm done. So, Yeshikoyach, that was just tremendous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Any comments, Rachel or Danielle?
Well, the thing that I find interesting as well in the Alman version of the Blue Book SINI is that you get this interesting clash in the tenor and alto. I think in bar 7, where you've got an E in the tenor and an E sharp in the alto, or something like that, which again isn't in the original. And sort of it's interesting that Alman's kind of reharmonized some of the
there you go. Which bar are you talking? 1, 2, 3, 4.
I think it's probably bar 7, but there's this interesting clash, which actually you don't notice when you're performing it. But
between what? What clash?
The E and the E sharp in the alto and tenor.
Can I add something?
Yes, please.
Please.
There is a new edition of the old Blue Book. It's called the New Book by the Reverend Rabbi Schisler, which obviously has nothing to do with the Blue Book, but there are some very nice pieces which he sung with the Sinai School at Cantor. And I was under the impression that a lot of our stuff came from either Poland or Germany. And I believe the Reform was not happy with the way the Orthodox were behaving themselves in shul, and that's why they started issuing music or playing music. But I think there's a lot in common with what the Reform movement and the Orthodox. Obviously, they're not allowed to have women, but I know from my aunt's Stepney Green Shul, which was an Orthodox shul, but it had a mixed choir. Because I remember as a kid sitting up with my aunts and singing a lot of the songs we all know. But if you get a chance, everybody, to get hold of the Reverend Shisler Blue Book, because there's some very, very nice pieces which I have used in Chaperit at Belmont United Synagogue, trying to introduce new songs.
I would love it if you would like give us some information for where we could find it.
Well, he has got an email address or website. If you look under Rabbi Shisler, S-H-I-S-L-E-R, Shisler, who was a Chazan at Kenton United. He's now retired. He doubled in Edgware United and in Bournemouth in Hampshire. See how you make out.
All
if not,
right.
come back to me at maminsky@hotmail.com. M-A-M-I-N-S-K-Y. Maminsky@hotmail.com, and I'll try and help you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's very nice.
So,
During lockdown, I had the opportunity to listen to Rachel Goldman, the other lady cantors, and Mayor Finkelstein was a Chazan, me as a teenager in the Cathedral School in Dunstan Road, Golders Green. And that the I have used. And one or two people said to me, "Oh, that's Finkelstein." I said, "Yes, you're correct. I'd like to learn some more."
It is an absolutely beautiful piece.
It is. And what follows on is also very nice, which I've got to get my head around. But well done to the ladies for such a wonderful, inspiring, and interesting discussion. Thank you very much. I've got to go. I've got to go to show.
Thank
Well
you.
done.
Thank you. So we'd like to, so
come in
let
here
me
and
see.
tell
Hold on one second.
story?
1 second, Robert. Alex has had his hand up for a while. So Alex Klein, you're not,
Alex
need
Knapp.
to,
I think it's Alex Knapp who has his hand up.
Alex, no, Alex, I know they both did, but
Okay.
Alex Klein is trying to speak and he's
Right.
muted. Okay.
Information about the book, Jeffrey Schlitzer's book, it's published by the Council of Chazanim of Greater Montreal. It comes with 2 CDs which are sung by Gideon Zellermeyer. So you can get it in Canada, I presume. Arrangements are accompanied with Stephen Glass.
Oh, he's good.
That's the information there. I'm surprised that Blackie not mentioned in the conversation to do with music composed or choral music in Anglo-Jewry, because he was for many, many years the choir master of the Liverpool Old Hebrew congregation, or Prince's Road Synagogue, where they had and they still have a mixed choir. I think it's the only Orthodox synagogue left with a mixed choir. Hampstead had a mixed choir till the 1970s, and there was probably about a dozen Orthodox synagogues from the Victorian era onwards who had mixed choirs. So it wasn't unusual. It wasn't something.
Yeah, so the issue of Prince's Road is kind of an interesting one. The reason that we didn't talk terribly much about it is that I think that both Danielle and I, our research tends more towards the non-Orthodox end of things. But one of the things that I found interesting about the choir at Prince's Road was that they were essentially forced to make a choice by the United Synagogue. The United Synagogue did not want to have mixed voice choirs. And you had a choice of either getting rid of the women in your choir, I mean, not like murdering them, but removing them from the choir, or removing yourself from the United Synagogue. And Liverpool chose, Prince's Road, chose its choir over membership in the United Synagogue. That's what they've told me. That is what they've told me.
Ariel Abel is the rabbi at Prince's Road, a very, very orthodox and very learned rabbi. And he is then invited to rabbinical conferences by Chief Rabbi Mervis. So he hasn't been excommunicated.
No, it's not a question of excommunication. They don't belong to the corporate body of the United Synagogue. They're still an Orthodox.
there are many shuls who are Orthodox that don't necessarily belong
Yeah,
to the United States,
and they
recognize the chief rabbi.
Yes, and Princess Road, I think, is, you know, they're not part of the organization. They're one of these shuls that is not part of the organization of the United Synagogue. They independently recognize the chief rabbi, and because they're not part of the organization, they can maintain a mixed choir. That is what they have told me.
It's a possibility, but it's a very, very difficult, it's a thin line in the sense that in the olden times, because you couldn't see the choirs and they were in choir rooms usually above the Orient Kodesh, some people couldn't differentiate between a boy alto soprano and a woman's voice, and you can hear this on recordings where people say, oh, I can't listen to women singing, not realizing that with like Machtenberg's choir and people like that they had boy soloists and boy singers as opposed to women singers. So if you can't recognize it, I rest my case. It's a tragedy in my humble opinion, because singing is a gift, a God-given gift, and if we're praising Hashem, and this is me, an Orthodox guy talking, that why shouldn't we use what God-given talents we have to sing praises to Hashem? This is from the temple, from the Levium, from way back when, from the Shirah, with Miriam singing and the Devorah singing, and there's many, many examples of biblical times, women singing, and I don't understand it. It's just a matter of interpretation.
We like your interpretation. You can stay. We like you.
Thanks, Rachel.
I'm sorry. To Alex now.
Hello. So I knew this was going to be a stimulating event, and it was. It was fantastic. Really enjoyed. Very illuminating. I'm bubbling over with all sorts of things here, but that's going to take too long, so I'm going to really limit it right down. First of all, the whole question about that clash in Esa'inai, which I've often heard people, especially male voice choirs, singing with tremendous gusto, and E natural against an E sharp. I mean, it really is completely out of character in that style. I mean, I know that Alman was very much interested in modernizing, shall we say, the whole language of Jewish music, oral and also vocal, and of course instrumental. He composed a lot of instrumental music as well. But why cannot we think that that was just a misprint? And I think that that is actually what it was. I don't think he tried to change the original Verinder. I think just somehow somebody didn't proofread correctly. And since then, it's been sung by many, many congregations in this really rather dissonant manner. The thing is that with dissonances and with errors of that kind, they can be very creative sometimes, but not in this case. In this case, it just sounds wrong. But the other thing about the Blue Book, we tend to think of it as a kind of urtext. This is, kind of, Missinai, and that therefore cannot be questioned because it is, and it's a wonderful compilation of all sorts of music from all over the European Jewish world and Anglo-Jewish world. I mean, it's really magnificent, but it's not the way necessarily the original composers intended it, because it was arranged by Francis Lyon Cohen and B.M. Davis. These were musicians who wanted to make it perhaps a little more accessible, and so therefore you've got versions of Mombach and Lewandowski and Beethoven and Mendelssohn and a few other people as well. And it's all been arranged away from the original. Now, it's perfectly clear, it does say arranged by so-and-so, so nobody's trying to pretend that these are urtext originals. But nevertheless, I don't think we ought to look at the Blue Book as being somehow academically a secure piece of scholarship. You have to be very careful with any of these compilations, and just to really look at each piece in its own merit and understand where it's come from and how it became what it became in the Blue Book and how it differs from the original version. I was wondering, though, I would like to ask Danielle a little bit about Verenda's musical style, because the Sinai, by the way, I once gave a talk about Jewish music and mentioned the Sinai and explained that this was composed by a German Christian organist at the West London Synagogue, and believe me, I was told off very, very severely afterwards. I was told off, you should not say that. I was told that I should not say that because it was somehow undermined the actual piece of music. I don't think it undermines the piece of music at all. But nevertheless, there is this very strong feeling that it is so Jewish, and so many people sing it within the Orthodox context, as well as all the other denominations, that somehow it had this kind of kosher quality, which was somehow undermined by my saying what the origin was. And I think, you know, it was unfortunate. I had to eat humble pie, but never mind, that was okay. But I was thinking of another piece by Verenda, which somehow goes to the other end of the spectrum. And that is the High Holy Day, Ane Ani, which I think is one of the most fabulous pieces of Jewish art music in existence, really. It really moves me tremendously. And I think somehow he captured something from Kol Nidre Yom Kippur that really is unique and quite remarkable. And my question, I do come to the question now, for Danielle, is how did he manage to be so imbued with a Jewish kind of, what you might call a Jewish spirit, in the setting of those very words that make that setting so powerful and so compelling, not only because it's in the minor key, which it is, but also because of somehow the way in which it works with the text to bring home something that really is redolent of the Yom Kippur mood, and to set that mood for the whole service.
Well, it's difficult to say this in terms of spiritual terms. I think his melodic writing and his harmonic writing is very varied, not in terms of characteristic, but in terms of, it sounds awful to say, but in terms of quality. He was often criticised for using too many chromatic modulations and all sorts of things, not just in his synagogue music, but in his church music and in his other pieces that he wrote for sort of concerts and things. And it's something that you can definitely see when you look at his sort of series of music for the services at the West London Synagogue. There are some quite unexpected modulations and things dotted all over the place. And I feel like with things like SINI and Ane Ani, he just got it right. And I'm not quite sure what changed specifically. Interestingly, he actually, he published a piano vocal arrangement of the Kol Nidre melody, which was criticised in the JC because they said, we don't quite understand why you've published it this way. It was published with Hebrew words, the Aramaic text, but then also with an English translation. And the English translation, which it's kind of there, you assume, so that people who didn't know sort of Jewish liturgy could also sing it. And it's so badly set that it just kind of it loses any of the beauty of the Kol Nidre melody at all. But apparently he'd also, for years before this, he'd been playing the Kol Nidre melody as an organ voluntary, apparently, for the Kol Nidre service, because they didn't actually sing the tune in the Sephardi shul. And so again, I think there were just moments where he was just, he very sensitively treated it, but there are lots of other moments where the music does feel quite functional, I suppose. So it's quite interesting, sort of, I've spent many a time playing through the various books of his music and going, oh, that's a really nice one, and that's interesting, and not sure that quite works. So it's just, I think, just the nature of being one of many, many sacred music composers of the 19th century, is my view. But thinking about the clash in the Blue Book, SINI, I think I looked at it when I realised it was there and thought, that must be a typo. And I think the only reason I decided it might not be is because of the voice leading, because there is this sort of sense that it is going to the minor, to the F sharp minor there, and just the way that the alto and tenor lines worked. But I'm equally up for being convinced otherwise. So.
Thank you, Danielle. So, Robert.
You are. A couple of small comments. First of all, I think one of the demises of the Orthodox men's choirs is when they decided to move the choir down into the shul. Beforehand, the children of the choristers would be very happy to sit with their dads and absorb the music. And once the choir was in the shul, I think that situation changed completely. The other thing I'd like to mention is the almost apocryphal story of Dudley Cohen, who was the conductor at Westhampton Synagogue when they had a mixed choir. And the chief rabbi, I think it was Chief Rabbi Brodie, lived fairly nearby, and he, of course, could not be seen to enjoy mixed choirs. But when he had to go to a United Synagogue, that's where he had to go. And Dudley Cohen met him in the lobby one Yom Tov and said, "Chief Rabbi, you'll be very pleased to hear that we have no mixed choir today." And the chief rabbi was quelling. He said, "Well, how did you manage to fix that?" And Dudley said, "Well, it's Thursday today, and all the men are at work."
Yay! So that is a wonderful story, and all I can do is respond with another apocryphal joke from World War II, that a high society matron in the South wanted to host some servicemen to dinner, and she called up the local army base and said that she wanted to have a dozen servicemen to come to her house for Sunday dinner, but please no Jews. And the appointed day came, and there was a knock on the door, and she opened the door, and there were 12 African-American servicemen. And the Southern belle said, "Oh, are you the ones that I invited?" And the leader of the servicemen said, "Yes, ma'am. Captain Cohen sent us."
Doreen, did you want to make a comment?
No, I just wanted to say, I challenged my own rabbi at Pinner United Synagogue about women not being able to sing in the synagogue in a mixed choir. And what he said to me was, it's not halachic, it's political, which I think proves that just men just want to have the power of decision. I'm not sure it's a particularly, bad thing. I mean, in the Zemel choir, we have sung at Hampstead Synagogue and at Liverpool in the past, and even we had a concert at Pinner one year. So, I think that it's hardened over the last few decades. This decision not to have mixed choirs.
Okay.
Tony, you had your hand up?
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Right. Two things. As far as Asar Enai, Verinder's Asar Enai is concerned, I happen to believe that probably it's sung in a lot of Orthodox synagogues without them realising that Verinder wasn't Jewish. I think because he's got a rather continental sounding name, they just assume that he was Jewish. Somebody said he was from Germany, but I think he was born in Wales, wasn't he?
He was born in Gloucestershire.
Oh, right. I wasn't that far away then. Now, the other thing is, you haven't mentioned, Danielle, somebody whom I regard as a very fine example of a Victorian Jewish composer who rejoiced in the name of Charles Kensington Salomon. Are you able to say? Do you have anything to briefly say about him at all?
I haven't done so much research into him, although obviously looking at the West London Synagogue and at Verinder, he's featured quite heavily. I think the thing that I was always entertained by was how he and Verinder seemed to blow very hot and cold on and off. So again, looking at issues of ownership, actually thinking about what we were discussing with Rachel, they were always at each other about who owned the copyright to particular pieces of music that one of them had written but the other one had arranged. So particularly the Psalm 84, which we sing at EHRS, which begins with the Mayadi dot.
Yeah, I was going to mention the Mayadi dot actually. Yep.
So that went through multiple different arrangements for choir and quartet and octet and all sorts of different things. And I think they really argued about who owned the rights to that piece of music, because they just did different arrangements, and one got published somewhere else and one got published in English and one got published in the West London volumes. And yeah, they seem to work they've worked together a lot and fell out a lot. And so that was something that struck me particularly.
It also,
if you go to the Sephardi Spanish, I know it's the Reform side at Hoop Lane Cemetery. As you walk in and turn left, Charles Kensington Salomon and his wife are the two stones on the left-hand side as you walk in. They're the first two stones on the Spanish the Reform side. I beg your pardon. Yeah. A very interesting, lovely piece of Victorian Jewish music, that Mayadi dot.
Yeah, well, he wrote a lot of sort of other mainstream compositions, and so both he and Verinder were very active in the London secular music scene. Both of them, their names crop up a lot in sort of with people like John Stainer and Charles Stanford. You know, these really kind of esteemed church musicians. They're all circulating together.
The other thing you didn't mention, very Hart, who you told me was let go by West London in order to employ Verinder. Can you expand on that at all?
Not a huge amount. I think there's a letter from Hart in the archives saying, I've been informed that my services are no longer required, and so Verinder took over the role of choir master as well as organist, I think in 1862, something like that. But then Hart seemed to carry on working with the choir for a little bit longer after that, so I've not quite got to the bottom of it. But
he's in the blue. A couple of pieces are in the Blue Book, I think.
Yeah, and in the West London Synagogue volumes, there are pieces of his in there.
Thank you.
I mean, it seems part of it, the question between Verinder and Salomon also seems to be that the practice of copyright, that is the strength of copyright laws, was not as strong in the Victorian era as it has since become with the rise of the House of Mouse. So I think it was easier to have a copyright dispute of that sort at that time.
Well, there were quite a lot of things in the archives about not just copyright, but actually when they wanted to publish their works for a non-Jewish audience. And so I think one of the letters, or one of the discussions that happens in the archived letters is Salomon arguing with the wardens at the synagogue saying, you're saying that I can't perform one of my psalm settings in a church, but actually we've got all of these non-Jewishly composed pieces of music in our services, so I don't quite understand what the difference is. And it's sort of quite interesting kind of crossovers, and yeah, what was kosher and what wasn't is sort of an ongoing discussion.
They saw what happened to Yigdal when it became the god of Abram praise, and they said, never again.
So we want to give our big thanks to Rachel Adelstein and to Danielle Padley for a wonderful presentation. We really thank you all. We hope you all join us next Tuesday. I will be interviewing, along with Jeff Janesco from the American Archives, American composer and teacher Sam Adler for another session. And if you sign up, and we hope you receive our information, you'll see that we have every session every Tuesday planned out, I think the exception of one during the holidays through the end of December. So thank you so much for joining us, and thank you just for your attention and wonderful questions, and just another great session. Thank you all.
Thanks for having us. Thank you, Danielle.
Thank you, Rachel.
And thank you to Danielle's child, who did not bother us.
Yeah, he's going to bed next door.